Okay. Okay, should we get started? Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We're on Hadith number 14 of the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi. We've been going through this text for more than a year now, I think. And trying to go through it slowly to extrapolate different things and delve as much as we can into discussion to be able to see where there's relevancy to us. And so this hadith we started looking at last week, and we talked about it within the prism of kind of conceptually what's called the maqasid of the Sharia, or the objectives of Islamic law. Right, and I posed to people like, well, what's the point of Sharia to begin with? And the baseline definition we're working off of is that the implementation of Sharia is meant to increase benefit and reduce detriment. Right, it's not just a system that quite often we understand one-dimensionally, especially if it's religion that we inherit and is given to us at a level that's just about practice and do's and don'ts. So a hyper-legalization of Islam as a tradition removes now from it the depth that can only be ascertained when it's understood through its multiple dimensions: a robust theology, a very deep spiritual tradition, a set of ethics and values that informs practice, so that practice isn't an ends but it's a means to something. And this hadith in particular is a hadith that gets into some of the things that we see Imam Nawawi is kind of introducing at this juncture in this text. It speaks about character and etiquette. And so we want to talk about the first part of the hadith today within the prism of what's called sanctity of life. Right? It's a construct that we've likely heard a lot of times get discussed. But before we delve into it, can somebody read the hadith, the Arabic, the English, and you can read either or both and if you like. Yeah, go ahead, Nasir.
On the authority of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, may Allah be pleased with him, who said, the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, said, it is not permissible to spill the blood of a Muslim except in 3 instances: the married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and the one who forsakes his religion and separates from the community.
Can somebody read the Arabic? Don't everybody jump at one time. Yeah, go ahead.
عن عبد الله بن مسعود قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم يشهد ان لا اله الا الله واني رسول الله الا باحدى 3: النفس بالنفس والثيب الزاني والمارق لدينه تارك للجماعه. متفق عليه.
So, if you didn't come last week, we gave a foundational understanding that we're going to delve into more in terms of just how Sharia functions, right? This kind of hadith is one that individuals who craft narratives constructed in fear in a prism of anti-blackness tend to utilize to give people who don't have a foundational understanding of Islam, which is not something that our religion necessitates. Right, the bar to entry in Islam is not up here, it's very purposely down here. You can have a high level of devotion and a low level of literacy, but the recognition of a consequence of that is that now when somebody else is able to turn your text against you, it creates potential conundrum that says, well, what does this fundamentally mean? And to look at this in a vacuum and not look at it more broadly in terms of, well, just how does Islam function on a whole? We talked a bit last time, and I read an excerpt from a text that we'll kind of look at a little bit more in detail, where we were talking about what are the objectives of Islamic law, what are the things that it seeks to preserve. We talked about like fundamental modes through which certain things are derived, and how like capital punishments in and of itself are not things that one can just execute on their own, but necessitates the establishment of a true Islamic government with an Islamic court system established, and the understanding in the enactment of what's called the hadud, the had punishments, these capital punishments, is that there's a hadith that Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha narrates that the Prophet ﷺ essentially is saying to us that it's better to err in the prism of mercy than to err in the conviction, right? That if you have a way out, that you want to give a way out to the individual, because the whole idea is rooted in this sense of a sanctity of life within our tradition. And you see this from the onset of creation. Then the Adamic narrative of creation is rooted in this. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but we want to get to a place where we build relationships with terminologies. It's hard to have common definitions, but we learn the meanings of things through the names of things, right? So if I said laptop, everybody would know what I'm talking about. Do you know? If I said hoodie, like everyone would know what I'm talking about. Just like if I said live stream or iPad, there's not going to be ambiguity across the board. If I said to you a word like love, we probably wouldn't have a common definition across the board. If I said to you a word like forgiveness, or a word like compassion or integrity or honor or dignity, the way somebody taught us 2 + 2 = 4 concretely, we didn't necessarily have exposure. Quite often, the organic or implicit mode of learning renders for us unhealthy understandings of things, right? Like we have a lot of examples of unhealthy forms of love, transactional forms that necessitate that I have to do or be in order to have that understanding of love. Here, the same principle becomes important because the emphasis that Islam puts on the sanctity of life can't really be something that's just paid to lip service wise, or as a way where you're reacting to somebody who is challenging you because they want you to hate yourself and to see your Islam as a liability and not as an asset. And when we looked at some of the historical understandings as to how often the had punishments were carried out, right? If you remember the excerpt we read last time, in a 5-century time span of an Ottoman Empire, they had one recorded incident of a had punishment being carried out. Because the basis is that you are looking to preserve life. You're not looking to just, at your own whims, go and engage in things that desanctify the value of life. How would you define the sanctity of life? If somebody was to ask you, like, well, what does this mean? And to understand it as an overarching, broader framework, we're going to look at some things that give us an insight as to what Islam says, right? But like, you know certain things. Knowing something in and of itself doesn't mean that it comes to bear kind of a prism on how I process reality. One of the verses we're going to look at today is in Surah Al-Isra that says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that all of the children of Adam are dignified, uncategorically, like Muslim, non-Muslim, every race, every culture. This is what we understand, right? That an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab to an Arab, a black to a white to a black. It informs a theology that's rooted in this idea of the sanctity of life. What does that look like for an individual Muslim, for a Muslim community, for a theology rooted in this principle? If we were to give a definition of what the sanctity of life denotes, like what would that mean? Does the question make sense? So just we can get started talking a bit, you want to turn to the person next to you. How do we define this? Like, what does it bring up for you? If you've never been here before, the idea isn't that you only talk when you're saying, quote unquote, the right thing, or you become silent because you're worried about saying the wrong thing. We want to be able to learn from each other's perspectives and insights. We want to be able to also hear ourselves express what we think so that we're able to come to a place of recognition about our own perspectives, let alone how we understand and absorb other people's perspectives. Do you know what I mean? But this religion, at its base, it is about the preservation of life. This is one of the objectives of Islamic law, the maqasid of Sharia. And the sanctity of life is a very important part to this. So knowing what that means is going to be an important part. So you can turn to the person next to you, ideally in pairs, right? So everybody gets to talk, chance to talk and kind of hear things out. But if it's a little bit more, that's fine too. Like, how would you define this? What does this mean, the sanctity of life? And then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
Since you were familiar,
I agree with him. Nah, I just want to know what that word is. Oh, basically just like a group.
Okay, so if somebody came to us and said, what is this thing? The sanctity of life. Like, how would we begin to give definition to it?
right? So there's
Go ahead.
What do we discuss?
We got one here. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Why are you laughing so hard? You're not laughing so hard? Okay.
We discussed as a group and we reached a group conclusion, which is very nice. We think that, life is very sanctified because the human being, itself is very sanctified. Because it's like the best thing Allah has ever created. That's why life is sanctified itself. And the reason why the human being is so sanctified is because a human being represents much more than physicality, right? When we look at an animal or a plant or anything, there's only so much that it can grow into, right? For example, a seed can only grow into a tree or a flower. An animal can only, do as much as it can do. But a human being, there's literally no limit to what it can grow into, what it can do. You know what I mean? So when you pluck a seed, you're only killing a tree. When you kill like a small animal, you're only killing, just like a carnal thing. When you kill a human being, on the other hand, you're not only killing the physical body, you're killing all the hopes, the dreams, and the infinite potential that it has. So I would say, like, what makes it so devastating to see so many, children dying in Gaza is not the number, for me at least, right? It's like all the potential that is just being lost, all the unique faces, all the smiles, and like who knows what these children would have grown into, right? Because you can't tell. Like with a seed, you know what's gonna happen. With a human being, like a doctor, a lawyer, who knows? Like it's just every human being is so unique with infinite amount of potential, and that's why each life is so sanctified, because each life is unique in its own infinity. You know what I mean? So I feel like that's why it's sanctified, and that's why we should always protect them.
Yeah. So if we start to distill this now towards this idea of like a sanctity of life, right? Like, how do I demonstrate a sanctity of life? What is a sanctity of life? Do you get what I mean? If we can kind of understand this as a basis that talks about why a human life should be sanctified, but how does that get executed or implemented? Do you know? Does it mean like I give you food? Does it mean that, we like break fast together? How would we give a definition to it from the standpoint of like a process, or from the standpoint of, even if we were to define it, the way I could say like a chair is a piece of furniture, right? A, laptop is a like device of technology. What is this thing that is a construct, like that is a sanctity of life? Does the question make sense? What else do we discuss? Yeah.
Well, we were discussing a bit about like levels of sanctity, and then I was sharing thoughts that I feel even the things of nature, like the living things, trees, animals, like they have their sanctity, and like I could cry for a tree the same way I cry for a person. And then it's like if we, it's kind of like if we're not carrying that awareness to like our brother and sister in humanity, it's like harming our own selves. And then I see it the same, like we are connected to the natural environment, we're just less aware of that. So it's the same, like we're not carrying that awareness to them.
But what does it look like to carry it to your brother and sister in humanity? Like, how do you do that? How do you demonstrate that? Do I let you come live in my house? Do you know what I mean? Like, do I give you my car? Like, if we leave it ambiguous, then it has the ability to fluctuate in a prism of moral relativism, right? This religion is saying all human life is sanctified. What does that mean? Yeah.
I think to answer your question, it kind of goes back to the previous hadith of loving your brother, what you love your sister, love yourself, because if you would treat other people around you the way that you would want to be treated, or the way that you would only treat the best of people, like, I don't know, your sister or your family, then you would begin to implement, like, what your question is.
Yeah, good. Right? And this is why you want to think of these hadith together. There's a reason why they go in a certain order in the chapter, So the one before this, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. That not one of you will have complete iman until he loves for his brother, and by extension his sister. And we said Imam Nawawi says this is in reverence to your brother in humanity, not brother in faith alone. Until he loves for your brother what you love for yourself, right? If we can connect it at that level, and we start to give a definition, the first thing we want to understand is that the sanctity of life is a belief. Does that make sense? It's not something you can hold in your hand, right? But it's a conviction in some kind. Do you see what I mean? Belief is something like you believe in one God. Do you know? So Allah is the only God that we believe in. And in Islam, it's a very pure monotheism. Do you see what I mean? You can believe in angels. You can believe in messengers, right? Just like you can believe in like justice and truth. You know, you can believe that generosity is important. But the sanctity of life is not just a concept or some kind of ideology. It is a belief. And we can inform our theology through understandings of Quran and Hadith that influence belief through concepts like this. Now, if it's a belief, what is it a belief in? And who is it that then espouses the belief? Because just like any belief, it's subjective. How can you and I believe fundamentally the same thing? Do you know what I mean? Right? I could dress the way you dress. You could dress how I dress. We're both wearing hoodies, right? Do you know? You're wearing a hoodie too, and you're also wearing a hoodie. You're not wearing one. You don't get to be our friend, right? So the four of us are wearing hoodies, right? We can dress the same way. Do you see? That's not how religion functions at the level of Iman. It's not even the way it functions at the level of Aqidah, because you can have creed that's codified that you memorized, but it doesn't mean you believe it, right? Belief is something that is subjective. It has to come from within. You can't believe it because somebody else believed it in the way that you can dress how somebody else dresses. Do you know what I mean? So now as we distill this more, a sanctity of life is a belief that I have, and it kicks in when? When I see any other human being, regardless of their race, their culture, their class, their gender, their socioeconomic status, their level of education, their age, their profession. You could go through a gamut of boxes that people can be put into. But fundamentally, we are not creating gradations based off of physical capacity and ability or a lack thereof, disability, special needs. We're not categorizing based off of height or weight or hair color or eye color or skin color. But the sanctity of human life is a belief that subjectively I can profess from within, that I now see every person through that prism of humanity, and then I see them as equal in their humanness. There's an equivalency that comes into play in this shared aspect of humanity. And through the recognition of that, the belief that now sees us in it informs me to this individual in front of me has a sanctity, an inviolability, something that necessitates me engaging them and treating them with the utmost of moral understanding. As the hadith before says, you will not enter, not any of you will have complete iman until you love for others what you love for yourself. Then you start to delve into how this impacts ritual, right? So we have a prayer that's gender separated for a variety of reasons that we could get into. But fundamentally, other than the distinction of a gender separation in our prayer, you get to just pray next to the person you pray next to. There's not meant to be special spots for certain people or other people. There's even different fiqh opinions, but opinions that would say, like the person who typically leads the prayer, if you know that they're late to coming to the prayer, do you wait for them to lead the prayer or not? But in understanding the idea that embedded within this is this sense of like respect, dignity, that I see you for your humanity. It's antithetical to an ideology rooted in whiteness. And you have to understand that, because you cannot have a sanctity of life when you have a system that is stratified, that is built off of setting now a stratification through prisms of race and racial supremacies. So when you try to understand how is it possible that somebody is not just the person who hit the button to drop the bomb that killed the baby in Gaza, or not just the person who created the plane that carried the bomb, or not just the person who signed the bill that gave the money to purchase the bomb that went into the plane that was then dropped, but going back all the way to the person who utilized their spiritual gifts to build a weapon that could kill someone's life. Like, nobody makes a bullet because they think it's not going to be shot at someone. And the theology is not then rooted in something as simplistic as we all just respect one another at a level of lip service. The majority of the world, if you see in the way that it wrestles and struggles with principles of race and class again and again and again, and has disdain for people that are different from them, they don't exert a sanctity of life, right? And that's not a stretch. Like, you can literally see it in the way that policies are conducted, in the ways that people can determine who has and who has not. Every system that you look at that understands, like if you try to understand civil rights movements, movements like Black Lives Matters, all of these types of things through this prism of what our tradition teaches us, a sanctity of human life, you'll find that pretty much most spaces that we spend our days in are rooted in the opposite of this belief. And then you start to think out, well, like, how do I formulate for myself my own belief system? And I ask myself questions that are not self-deprecating, but rooted in a sense of, do I see the person that sleeps on the street outside of the building on my way to the subway still as my sister and brother in humanity? So the Prophet Muhammad did, alayhi salam. When you hear hadith where he stands and he looks at the Kaaba and proclaims its majesty and says that, like, the inviolability of the human is greater than your sanctity, meaning the sacredness of every person in the room, according to the messenger of God, is greater in sanctity than the Kaaba. Right? Like, when you are in a place where you hear hadith, the Prophet stands in front of his companions, the Hujjaj, as they're there, and he asks questions, right? Ayu shahrin hadha, that what month is this? They know it's the month of Dhul Hijjah. Ayu baladin hadha, pointing in the direction of Mecca. They know it's the city of Mecca. Ayu yawmin hadha, they know it's the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, the day of Arafah, arguably the most auspicious day in the calendar. What our teachers tell us is the silence that the companions give to the Prophet in response to these questions is not because they don't know the answers when he's asking, right? Ayu baladin hadha, ayu shahrin hadha, ayu yawmin hadha. But they, out of deference, don't respond to the question. And also, they say if the Prophet said it's something else, they would have just gone with what he said. So if he said this is now called like something different, if this month is named something, they would just go with it because it's what he's saying. But when he establishes that they're unarguably the most auspicious day in an auspicious month in an auspicious city, he reiterates the same message. Know this, that there is an inviolability, right? Your lives, your wealth, all of this stuff, it is more sacred than this day in this month in this place. That is part of our theology. Do you see? And when you bridge these hadith, you try to figure out how did Muslims get to a place where they say, I'm not going to let my kid marry somebody from a different race or culture. Purely based on that variable alone and nothing else. I'm going to only pray behind somebody who has the same skin color as me. It's the same jahili tendencies that has us remove a sense of a sanctity of life. You can find commonality. It makes sense as to why you'd want to hang out with people that understand what it's like for you and your struggles and the realities that your communities have faced within the complexity of what makes us who we are. But when I start to think that I'm better than you or worse than you, that's not the sunnah, that's supremacy. And the sunnah is the opposite of whiteness. Do you see? And when every system that influences us, education, all the curriculum, the corporations, the industries, everything that you step in is about an egocentricity, not a God-centricity. It centers the self in this way. It creates now a tunnel vision that has me not even notice that you're present or absent. You're invisible, let alone looking at you with disdain. There are some elements of society that are built off of this theoretically, right? So if I'm a doctor and my patient is racist against me, I still perform the procedure on the patient, right? Do you know? In theory, right? Do you know what I mean? You're a doctor, right? Do any of your patients ever bother you? All the time? Do you ever like mess with their medication or anything? Do you know what I mean? Huh? Are you sure? No, right? You don't. You can't do that, right? But nobody would assume that that's a problem if a doctor continued to perform services even for an ungrateful patient, a racist patient. But it kind of like starts and stops there. Do you see? And the conditions and qualifications that are not about becoming somebody's doormat, it's not about validating oppression or inequity, that's not what we're saying. But a fundamental general principle, belief in this religion is that we have a sense of a sanctity of life. And every religion does not have this. And it is not a universal ethic in the sense that every community like espouses this. The last prophet of God sent as a prophet to all of humanity with a final testament has a set of ethics that are universal because it's meant to be for everybody, right? So how could a sanctity of life not be embedded within this? Do you see what I mean? If we look at the Adamic narrative of creation, Adam alayhi salam is created and everything is told to prostrate to Adam. And everything does except Iblis. The act first of a prostration to Adam creates for us symbolically a notion that there is a certain dignity to humanity. That's not meant to create arrogance, but you look at things in conjunction. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, Surah Baqarah says that indeed that Allah has sent us as a khalifa on the earth, meaning that most of creation lives out of whack, not because the dogs stop being dogs or the birds stop being birds, but humans stop being good at being human and didn't own up to that recognition in an Adamic narrative of creation that Adam alayhi salam was somebody who was worth all of creation doing what Allah commanded them to do, which was to now show some aspect of subservience. And then the second part, the only one who doesn't do it is Iblis. And what does he say? I am made of fire, he is made of earth. Why would I debase myself in this way, right? Meaning where I come from makes me better than where he comes from. Do you know? But our tradition says what? An Arab does not have superiority over a non-Arab. A black does not have superiority over a white, right? And the inverse is true, right? A non-Arab does not have superiority over an Arab. A white does not have superiority over a black. And then the qualification that comes in, except through piety and good actions. But that's only in the eyes of Allah. Allah is the only one that can determine that, right? And I start walking now through this world and just pay attention to how many different things that you consume on a daily basis that render inwardly not a numbness or exhaustion, but a simple passivity. Do you know? If you live in New York City, do you know what I mean? How many trains do you take in New York City on a day or a week? And majority of these subways don't have any accommodations for people who are on crutches or wheelchairs, right? Let's just even think about that for a moment. Do you know? And the few that do, they're always like messed up or broken. Do you know? How would you expect somebody to be in a place where they get around New York? You're gonna take a $60 Uber every single time you gotta go somewhere? You know? You're gonna be in a place where you're in a wheelchair and you gotta go through like the snow or a blizzard? Whoever is building those things and validating those things, they're not thinking about every single part of humanity. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? I went to Malaysia. I visited a Quran school that was established for children with special needs. It's a beautiful place. People who had kids that were deaf, they were blind, they didn't have the ability to speak, they had other like learning needs. And when I talked to them, it was their parents who started this school. And when I said, well, what was the motivation? One of the mothers said to me, I got tired of going to the masjid and asking them to teach my kid how to read Quran, and their response kept saying to me, well, your kid is going to be guaranteed Jannah anyway, so it's okay if he doesn't know how to read the Quran, right? وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam. That we see dignity in all of the children of Adam. Capacity is a different question, right? But in being able to understand fundamentally this as a basis, the sanctity of life, and Iblis's action is an act of racism. And you can't think about this as anything other than reality. And what is like the biggest source of ailment and social injustice in the world, if not race and class issues, again and again and again? People don't want you to see the value in all of humanity. They don't want you to find a certain sense of equality amongst people who come from different backgrounds than your own. They benefit from you buying into narratives of fear that then justify passivity. Somebody was asking me the other day in relation to some of this, right? Like, how does prison abolition function within Islam as a religion? And I said, well, like the emancipation of slaves is constantly mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith. And I said the parallel that you'd want to make is that our system of anti-blackness essentially builds a prison industrial complex that is rooted in slavery, that then just remanifests itself in Jim Crow, and then has black people getting channeled into the prisons because it became corporatized, and nobody cares about black people. And the idea of how we understand our theology in a prism of modernity and answer questions that are rooted here and now and today. That I benefit from systems that contribute to oppression and inequity. And it's not going to get broken down unless I'm willing to forego what it is that I benefit from the systems that hurt others. You will not have complete iman until you love for others what you love for yourself. Do you see what I mean? And this sanctity of life becomes really, really important. If I really bought into a sanctity of life, right? How would it not impact my spending habits, my overall consumption? How would it not play a role in determining whether I spend some weekends at a soup kitchen volunteering? Do you get what I mean? And that's what the purpose of belief is. It's supposed to inform what it is that our decisions look like. And it's not just by my own logic or whatever else, but this is a good belief because Allah and His Messenger say it's a good belief. And you can contrast it to other systems. They don't believe it, man. They could fundamentally care less. Let's do this, because I've been talking for a longer spurt of time than I feel like I normally do, but you might say no, that's not true. Let's turn to the person next to us for a minute. What are you taking away so far? Like, what's coming up? Why do you think this is an important conversation to have, right? Let's talk about it for a bit, and then we'll come back and discuss, but go ahead.
Because, you know, we can have, like, we all have bias. So lots of people have music, that person's especially taking up a whole role. I think I may find it annoying, but that doesn't diminish that he's like my brother. He's just like somebody that I should love and respect him. I should think of him more as like sad instead of crying. That's what I'm doing. got one time, like, you know, actually, I just didn't listen to them. Like, why me? I'm like, yo, that's not. Out of people might look at it that way, I'm like, there's nothing wrong with you, get something to like, for me, like, I'm happy, like, amazing to know what you're doing, what I'm talking about, what I'm doing, what I'm and like what he made out of it, like what he did, like what Adam, God created Adam, I made it out of this. Still doesn't like really care for whatever environment is doing with that. Because whatever you're doing is good there, or that modern way to go down. Go ahead, bro.
Okay, so what are some of the things? What are some of the things that are coming up? What are we discussing? Who wants to start? What do we talk about? Yeah.
I think that something that we were talking about is how the notion of like convenience being so hardwired in everything that we do is very contradicting to this idea of loving for other people what you love for yourself, in the sense that, like, for example, I was speaking through the personal lens of, it's so easy to say, yes, like I love peace and I love all of these things for other people, but like as soon as I need something, I just order it off Prime really quickly because I know it's going to come the next day. And understanding that like that moment of convenience for me hinders other people's lives and their ability to function in the way that I love for myself because of what Amazon stands for and what they do as a corporation. So allowing there to be reflection that isn't necessarily self-deprecating, but really necessitates you to take a look at your actions and really honestly just say, what are you valuing over what it is that you claim to be valuing for other people?
Yeah, and if you add to it an element of how do you value the here versus value the hereafter, right? And you don't divorce the way theologies inform one another, but a recognition of the sanctity of life in the frame of what we're talking about now is also something that gives an indication that this life builds into another life, right? Like we have multiple frames of existence. Do you know what I mean? May Allah make us people of Jannah. So where and how it starts to kind of shape and engage kind of across, and I treat people based off of who I am, not what it is that everybody else around me is doing necessarily. Do you see what I mean? What else did we talk about? What else came up for people? Yeah.
We were just talking about how like, even though like it's like inherent in the Quran that like we should not be discriminatory towards people of like different skin color or different races or things like that. That even though like you deliver that message really well, it's really unfortunate that like the people that need to hear that message might not like necessarily be in your class. Like just like that, the irony behind that.
Who are the people that need to hear it?
Just like I mean, I mean I don't want to like
Is it someone in this room, right? Is it Omar because he's treating his patients bad? Yeah. No, yeah, but you want to think about it from like our tradition is the spiritual part to our tradition has us see how we fit into things, right? And I want to be able to think about how does it apply back to me? Do you know? And how do I get to a place where I have this sense of recognition that I'm not defeated based off of like other prevailing ideologies? You know, we have an election tomorrow that some people are likely stressed about, maybe some people are indifferent about. We have a tradition that tells us that even if the hour is upon us and you're planting the tree, like you still plant the tree. So regardless of who wins tomorrow and how it is that things go under them, we still plant the tree. Do you see what I mean? You don't get tied up in places where perspective is informed by those who seek to control belief. And if you believe everything stops with every type of fitna, that's not an Islamic belief. Do you get what I mean? And embedded in the ideologies that our religion, unfortunately, is quite kind of rare in comparison to what other ideologies espouse around some of what we're talking about tonight. This also means that like your existence is precious and you cannot build your self-awareness through a prism of self-loathing that internalizes racisms through systems and structures that were purposely built to make you feel as if there's nothing good within you. Do you see? Yeah.
I have a question kind of following up with that. So my question is kind of like, you were talking about like how try to like avoid like the idea of like not validating depression or like identity and that kind of thing. So my question was like, how do you balance preserving your own sanctity while not validating oppression? Because like from my understanding, like, we're not a religion of like turn the other cheek kind of thing. When you have an onus to like preserve your dignity when it's being questioned or undermined. But like, how do you do that in a way that's like dignified in the eyes of Allah?
Well, the Hadith is going to talk about capital punishments, right? But it's setting the general principle, and then it's going to carve out a few examples of where, if something was to happen, this is like a permissibility. Do you know? And it's not exhaustive. There's other things that are mentioned. But again, like the enactment of it is something that is not done on an individual basis. Do you know? And capital punishment is not the only form of consequence for like problematic behaviors in our tradition. There's a bunch of other things that kind of come up as well, including ideas of restorative justice, right? But these are things that get executed within particular cases, do you know? And so where and how you think about things contextually, like there will be understandings of like codes of engagement ethics also, because you will have things like conflict and battle and war and whatever else, right? But the general principle is this, that human life is sanctified. Do you see what I mean? The default in our religion isn't that there are certain elements of humanity by virtue of where they come from, that they somehow are lesser in value, even if they don't share religion with us. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense?
I think that's kind of addressing it more of the conceptual and structural level, but I was thinking more so like interpersonally, or like how someone could see that like in their own lives.
Well, the specifics of it would depend on what the kind of like particulars are of the instance and what kind of measures of recourse are available to an individual. Do you know what I mean? Like fundamentally right now, what is like the most, what is like the main way of resistance that many people in the world right now have in the Congo, the Rohingya, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Sudan, right? The Uyghurs, their existence is fundamentally like their mode of resistance to those who seek to oppress them and push them down. The conversation might be different if we're talking in the confines of Manhattan and New York City to somebody who's been robbed, somebody who had a family member like victim to homicide, somebody who was, a survivor of an assault in some capacity. Do you see what I mean? And that's where the implementation of Sharia is not done reductively. It necessitates understanding other variables that come into play, right? But we want to establish today is a recognition that the religion in and of itself, its default understanding is that like human life is sanctified, it's sacred. Does that kind of make it a little more distilled? Yeah. And understanding how it plays out sometimes requires us to just kind of sit with a concept a little bit, do you know? And think about like how does it play out and how much of the world functions actually anti this notion, right? Like it surrounds us all the time. And it starts to then seep into our perspectives and our kind of like visions of things. The particulars of this is around a sanctity of life that honors life to the extent that like it's not for me to engage in any of these abhorrent practices. In a pre-Islamic Arabia, they were literally burying their daughters alive, right? Female infanticide is practiced. The Quran poses the question, right, of the girl who will ask for what crime she had committed that she was killed. Do you know? May Allah grant us ease on the Day of Judgment. If you go for Umrah with us, when we go to Mecca, we'll show you the pot where these women were actually buried, these young girls. It still exists and it's an uncovered area. I think when we went last year, we showed it to people. We definitely did too. We showed it last year to people. Yeah, right? Do you know? And that land testifies like to what was done upon it. Do you know what I mean? In like a Meccan society, they didn't have a sense of kind of codified law or penal codes or norms that you could pretty much get away with killing a lot of people. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who's narrating this hadith, he is a poor companion who is physically not like a large individual, right? He's described as somebody who's physically of a small stature. His students describe him because he's prolific in his understanding of Quran and so much. He informs the establishment of the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam because of his influence on the people of Kufa. He's described by his students as being someone who was dark-skinned and had braids, right? He was a black companion. Do you know? He's telling us this hadith as a black man who was the first to read Quran out loud publicly in Mecca. He recited Surah Rahman and they beat him, right? And the companion said, like, don't do it. And when he did it and he got beaten, they said, we told you this would happen. And he said, I'm going to do it again tomorrow if I need to, right? But the reality of how it trickles down in a Meccan society, the only time somebody generally would stand in response to some type of inequity was if someone from a clan did something to dishonor another clan, you know? It wasn't rooted in an idea that we sanctify human life. If anything, it was something that really could care less sometimes about what it was that was going on. And we see replications of this in the ways that a lot of things function today. Do you know? My daughter was born a few days before there was a shooting in Connecticut, right? The Sandy Hook like school shooting, if people remember this. This is 12 years ago. My daughter was born in December, on December 15th, and she was born in 2012. And I remember vividly, for a lot of different reasons, as to things that were going on. And we had, back then, like vigils that were held on the steps of the building next door at the Kimmel Center, right? And my daughter had been home for like 2 or 3 days. She was a baby. And my wife and I were at home with our first child, our newborn child. And they said, can you come speak at this vigil? All these kids got killed, do you know? And I looked at my wife and I said, what do you think I should do? She's like, how could we bring a baby home and love our baby if we didn't go and stand for people whose babies were killed? Do you know? but they don't fundamentally care. All the like social media posts, you hear this, right? But you want to actualize it in a prism of reality. Because step number 2 is, why do you keep trying to seek their validation? Why? They continuously still do not put any type of policies to control the flood of gun access to people, and babies are killing babies every day, let alone how many other things that are happening as a result of it. But they believe in what they believe in. It's not an us versus them. There's going to always be people, though, who will have triumph if there's not people like us who actually believe in what Islam says. And then pit that in a belief that there's a world after this one. Do you see? When the Prophet ﷺ is speaking to his companions, he's speaking contextually to populations that exist in Mecca and Medina, clans and tribes that did not have anything that was kind of narrowing who could decide to take someone's life in what way. Disputes were not settled in the ways that one might think. It wasn't like a wild, wild west type situation, but at the same time, if you come to the Sirah class that we do, right, and we talked about what it was like for the early Muslims to be persecuted by the people in Mecca, you know, they are like doing all kinds of atrocious things to people without any kind of consequence to many of them. And the Prophet's got to teach his companions that we don't do this kind of stuff. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who is a physically small person that comes from a low-income background, who is one of the early converts to Islam that was deeply persecuted, is a black companion of the Prophet of God in a society that is stricken with challenges around class and race and all things that stem from it. He is narrating this hadith that its first part is teaching us that we have a religion that has a sanctity of life. And letting that kind of simmer, that then says, how does that manifest in my choices and decisions? Who do I donate to? Who do I not donate to? Which causes rile me up? Which ones don't rile me up? The way that I vote, the way that I don't vote, the ease that I might decide to choose not to vote. There's going to be Muslims tomorrow who will vote for no other reason other than what's going to put them in a lower tax bracket and what's going to allow for them to retain more of their wealth and their income. How does it understand like this idea, وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ? Do you see? There's going to be all kinds of things that come up that can intellectualize things that make no sense and should fundamentally never make sense. And before we can talk about the situations that the hadith now gives us insight on, that again are only implemented within the prism of an established Muslim state, with an established Muslim court system, and the rigor of what is necessary to actually enact these things we talked about last week makes it next to impossible for it to happen. We have to understand that first, regardless of what anybody else thinks, you have to know that your religion teaches you that human life has a value to it. And it's important to understand that as a basis to how we experience our theologies. If we can really quickly look at Surah Al-Isra, we're going to look at the 17th chapter of the Quran, verse number 70. If people want to open that up. 1770. Anybody has it and they want to read it, you can read the Arabic or the English. 1770.
Indeed, we have dignified the children of Adam, carried them on land and sea, granted them good and lawful provisions, and privileged them far above many of our creatures.
Great, Jazakallah khair. Can somebody read the Arabic? Yeah, go for it.
ولقد كرمنا بني آدم وحملناهم في البر والبحر ورزقناهم من الطيبات وفضلناهم على كثير ممن خلقنا تفضيلا.
Jazakallah khair. Right? And this, you want to come back to this verse. وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Right? All of the children of Adam are dignified. They're honored. Right? You might have humans that dishonor themselves, right? لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, that we created humanity in the most beautiful of forms. ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ, and then we let them fall to the lowest of the low. But the default understanding is that we were created to exist in a state of dignity and honor. And the things that we determine debase an individual is not what society would necessarily coincide with. You can be a dishonorable millionaire or billionaire and have no honor and have no dignity. And you could be from amongst potentially the awliya of Allah and have not a cent to your name. The criteria through which honor is understood has to be looked at through some of these prisms. We unfortunately get surrounded with many examples of people who have lost any sense of honor and what it is that makes them honorable as humans. But we don't want to then follow in their sunnah. We want to follow in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, who is giving us an indication of how it is that we navigate the diverse world that we live in. And these hadith then start to inform one another, and we start to understand, hey, this is what actually makes a religion. It's not just the postures of a prayer that are a part, but not the absolute part. It's not just the mechanics that are a part, but it's not the only part. But there's parts to it that inform, why would I want to come to this? So the God who created all of creation, that said humanity has honor, and we have honored all of the children of Adam. It doesn't say that only the people of Iman. It doesn't say like only the people who are Muslim, right? وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. That's what the Quran says. You can't really debate it in any other way. So what I'd like for us to do is, how do we get to the point that we're at right now? That the relationship now between text and context, like what is it that contributes to the realities that we see, that create inequity, that create these oppressions, that create the stratifications in the ways that manifest themselves? Like, why is it so easy for people to not see the shared humanity in people around them? And you could think about it in whatever kind of case study you want to look at, right? How? How is there a sense, وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ? And I'm not saying it like in relation to anything specific. Just think about it, right? How do we live this hadith? There's 400 masjids in New York. How many like Muslim influenced food insecurity programs are there? How many domestic violence shelters are there? How many like free health clinics are there, right? How many resources are there in those kinds of ways? Do you see what I mean? And it's not like an either or, maybe it's a both and, but right now it's not even that there's consideration in one direction. Do you know? To have like Muslim candidates that look to be civically engaged, that root platforms on principles such as this. Do you see what I mean? When you go into any industry that you go in, are you going in with something that informs you in this way? So what makes it difficult? What's contributing? What's getting in the way that has me? Like, what makes it easy for me to not see the humanity in someone that is sitting across from me, right? We can talk to people just about it for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
Like a lot of ways. Like, let's say like, oh, black guy isn't, he's gonna have like, but just think about it, like, something starts in the home, like, just think about that, your parents respect so much. That's a big position, right?
Okay, so maybe we can get a couple of people. What are we talking about? What kind of gets in the way? What makes it easier for us to not see people in these ways? What are we discussing? Yeah.
We were, the brothers and I were discussing like some things that contribute to that is like to the society, like living in like a capitalistic society, individualism society. Your set is to just focus on you. I think even you mentioned a couple classes ago about like this unhealthy competitiveness to like be the best, but then it's like be the best in what? Like who tells you like this is the right version of being the best? Like those things like greed and all of that contributes to what you were saying.
Yeah, right. And that's why like taqwa is an important value and characteristic. May Allah make us from the muttaqeen. Because the idea isn't like I gotta run away from it. Where are you gonna run away to? Like at the end, you know what I mean? Right? There's like stuff, mess everywhere, you know? SubhanAllah, Allah make it easy. But the idea is even if I'm surrounded by it, I at least have like an awareness and a wakefulness of what's going on. So I'm not purposely engaged in it, nor am I succumbing to it without any type of kind of pushback or resistance, do you know? Like I'm making it so easy for you to captivate my heart. You've got control of me and you decide like what I eat and what I wear and all of like the time I spend watching what and speaking about what. I'm willfully just like giving it to you. Do you know? But at least if I have a consciousness that says like, no man, like this is what this is about. It's meant to yield this at the end of it. And I don't have to have an unhealthy mode of retributive anger sitting in my heart. I can have righteous anger sitting in my heart, but it still allows for me to, on my own terms, like walk through what it is that I'm walking through and then just try my best. That's just what Allah wants from me, right? And then when we stand in front of Him, He's gonna put everything in its place. Like, that's just what I have to trust, you know? Allah is the one that will balance out what is imbalanced. But me being imbalanced in an imbalanced world without even trying to be balanced or recognizing I'm imbalanced doesn't mean that I'm still not falling over. Do you know? Do you get what I mean? What else? What else did we discuss? And we'll wrap up in a couple minutes. Yeah.
I feel like just indifference and like apathy to like, you know, like to try and do the right thing. I mean, the kind of like the world that like, you know, the Quran describes is like, you know, should technically be like very simple and like, you know, like easy to live, you know? And I feel like there's like systems in our world that like external system or whatever that like pushes away from it. And us as Muslims, we're just like, we know it's wrong, but then we just like don't really care to like, you know, like correct it or like do the right thing, you know? And I feel like for example, if me in my heart, like, you know, like if I have a negative thought towards like someone else and I know like it's like un-Islamic, that's not what our religion teaches me. If it doesn't like pain me or like hurt me and like I like think about it, like, you know, make sure that never happens again. I feel like, especially in like New York, you have like so many interactions where like, you know, you have like all these thoughts that are like, you know, not in line with what like your Islam, you know? But if we just care to like brush. We don't care to like like think about it, reflect on it, like try to like do the right thing. Like the sister was talking about, like we know like everyone knows like Amazon is bad, not just like Muslim people. Like everyone knows that, and we just like don't really like care to like live our life in a way like Islam teaches us. We're like never gonna be better as a society, and like yeah, I feel like just indifference and like apathy is like one of the biggest reasons we're not like becoming better as a collective.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I feel like so many things come to mind, man. It's so hard to pick one thing to talk about when you mention these loaded questions. But like I think of like false prophets.
Loaded questions.
Is
that what it feels like?
We like follow a lot of things that we think are the answer, whether it's like who's the president, what is this, what is that, what's your strongest tool, when really like the Quran, God really has all the answers. It's really just like the gentleman in front of me, the brother was saying, like people tell us what we should do, how we should fit into a system, but like you don't have to follow that system. You could create your own system. So it's really just about trying not to get confused when we have so much stuff in front of us. You talked about visuals we see on the internet and stuff like that. So it's just about, I feel like we have a lot of things that are telling us what to do, and really the faith tells us how to treat humanity at its best. And we kind of don't put that first.
Yeah, and it's like, well, how do I even begin to determine what I believe in? Right? Who benefits from me being exhausted and worn out and running on empty? Right? Who benefits from me like being in a place where I have a sense of hopelessness and indifference and apathy? Do you know? And it's purposeful, right? Or I feel like I made it because I got X amount of dollars on a paycheck, or I got invited to this table, or I sat with this person or that person. But at the expense of what exactly, right? And not even for anyone else, but pushing it into a prism that says, how does this identify my potential placement in eternal existence? And I can do whatever I want to. I'm just gonna have to explain to God why I did it that way. Do you know? And you can read the Quran and it can help shape belief. But I can't point to a page when someone says, what do Muslims believe? And now I know in Surah Al-Isra, in its 70th verse, it says this. Like, how do you live that? Do you see what I mean? And this is where the Prophet ﷺ is described by his wife, that he was the, like, Quran walking, his character was the Quran. This is a verse that embodies like character behavior. Do you see what I mean? Because وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, then it makes a little bit different of a sense that smiling can be a charity, right? That I'm not just like forcing it, but I actually recognize kind of we share something in our humanness. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? There's a bunch of other things that we can kind of delve into here, but there's nothing that like is validated in this generic understanding of desanctifying human life. You can't even voluntarily consent to somebody else taking your life in Islam. Does that make sense? Right? Allah is the one that is the creator of life and death. The Prophet ﷺ stands for a funeral procession of a Jewish man that passes him. And the companions ask, like, he's not Muslim. And the Prophet says, was he not a living soul, right? There's a certain sanctity for life that Allah is the creator of this life. Do you see? And how and where I start to understand that within the particulars of things that are not just about like, did you invite me to your wedding? You didn't let me do this or that. But in its grossest manifestation of just like murder, like really, like think about it, man. Like you wake up in the morning and there's people in the world right now who are going to bed and they woke up the same way as you in a state of ease, And they were the ones that green-lighted the killing of babies. They're justifying like inequitous policies, unjust wars, in order to just retain power and privilege. You can't believe that you made it because you have proximity to power, or you've somehow gotten a percentage of some iota of privilege. And that's what whiteness seeks to do. It makes you want to seek validation by essentially becoming what it is that the ones who held you down were on their own as they were. Like, you're trying to be like your oppressors, right? Like, don't do that. Like, know who your teacher is. Do you know? And you meet their inequity with kind of your own successes in this mode. Even if the hour is upon you, you plant the tree, right? And you understand in a failed recognition of theologies that are very real, you're just living every day with a determination that what I put into this day is going to inform what my days eternally will end up being. May Allah make us people of Jannah. And it's not the only thing, right? But it's a big part of our religion that it becomes one of the 5 main objectives of Sharia, the preservation of life. Do you know? Like, you're starving to death and the only thing you can eat is ham. You eat the ham, right? You're dying of thirst and you have like a bottle of alcohol, like you drink the alcohol. Do you know? It doesn't mean that it's not a haram action, right? You don't like go home when you're safe and you're like, I'm gonna buy like a crate load of this stuff, you know, because whatever. But that's not how it is. But why does that happen? Because your life takes precedent over that, right? So Allah lifts the sin from the act because like you're gonna die. The preservation of life is what is important. You see what I mean? We are not a warmongering like people. We are not people who glorify war. Do you know? And like you live in a society that does. And you have to be awake so that you don't start seeing the world through that, or you become numb and desensitized as a result of it. And then the taqwa like kind of diminishes and you lose sight of like, well, what's really kind of happening around you? Do you know? Shaitan's been doing this from day one and orchestrating processes of inequity built to hold those who challenge those things to be in a place where they feel as if there's no point. There's always a point. Do you know what I mean? And you don't know. Like, I've gone to, you know, visit Rafah. You all saw pictures of me with children from Gaza. They felt like the love. You understand? And that's not something to undermine. But it's just like the consistency, the movement forward, right? You won't have complete iman until you love for people what you love for yourself. This is why we talked about, like, what do I love for others to even begin with? Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, so next week we'll kind of get more into this and kind of discuss it in like the particulars now of like the Hadith more broadly, kind of the things the Prophet ﷺ is talking about in specific, but we want to have a generic framework that the religion itself kind of adheres to a belief that is the sanctity of life and starting to define for ourselves what that looks like, right? And when you walk through the world, like just go objectively between this week and next week. Where do you see people who honor life? Where do you see people who dishonor it? And start to make mental notes, reflections. You think about like the spiritual gifts you've been given. Loving for others what you love for yourself also means it's okay to love things for yourself, right? But you can have a holistic understanding of how some of these things kind of play out. But a big part of getting to places of realization, walk through the same streets you walk through, but try to look at them through the prism of this verse. وَلَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. And you'd be astonished, like, you can't go 10 blocks in New York City without seeing some type of inequity. Do you know? But you gotta also look for like light. You also have to look for where there's hope. So where do you see the presence of some of this? And how we then start to communally think about what we build, what we grow, like why we do some of the things that we do, so that we're filling gaps and leaving the world a little bit better in whatever capacity, right? I don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow in this election. I can tell you though, we're gonna keep trying to build the shelters that we're building, right? We have clients now in our domestic violence shelter that we've built in the Bronx. May Allah make it a place of ease and replenishment for them. We're gonna continue to like feed the hungry. We're gonna continue to give clothes to people. The winter's coming, there's still migrants in the city. Last year, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people we helped, but we're gonna continue to do that because the hour is upon you. You still plant the seed, you still plant the tree. Do you see what I mean? And you push against whatever it is that's making you feel as if this one variable is what would put everything suddenly into place. The nature of it is that there's going to always be this kind of tug, push back and forth. And the way we demonstrate how it is that we function is that we let our strength be rooted in belief, conviction, that then compels action. And it's not just a matter of convenience, but I'm informed by some type of philosophy on life as to why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing. And you see the lackings in these other philosophies on life. Do you see what I mean? What I wanted to do, just like as we close out, I know tomorrow could be bringing up a lot of different things for people. And, you know, we'll take a pause on the halakha. Maybe, can one of you guys turn the live stream off also? And if anybody needs to head out, you can feel free to head out. But I wanted to give people an opportunity. Yeah, you can turn it off. And just like